There is a symbol that millions of eyes contemplate every year without the mind ever registering it. It is carved in stone, woven into mosaic, inscribed in the proportions of columns supporting consecrated vaults. It dwells at the periphery of perception, too present to be an accident, too subtle to be recognized. And for centuries, it has remained exactly where it was placed, in plain sight of everyone, invisible to nearly all. The symbol of the Illuminati may be hidden at the heart of the Catholic Church, not in the catacombs, not in sealed chambers or archives locked under 7 keys, but in the very spaces where cardinals walk, where the faithful pray, where tourists point their cameras at works that time has consecrated as sacred. The mark would have endured not through darkness, but through exposure, not through secrecy, but through audacity. Independent researchers and scholars of occult symbology claim that certain geometric shapes, recurring in architectural patterns, in Renaissance pictorial compositions, and in ornamental elements distributed throughout spaces connected to the Vatican, correspond with disturbing precision to the emblems associated across the centuries with initiatic societies and with modern narratives about the Illuminati. Not an isolated symbol, not a one-off coincidence, but a visual language that spans different eras, styles, and artists, as if obeying an intention that transcends any individual artist. The question that imposes itself is not a simple one, and it refuses easy answers. Could it be possible that the mark of a secret order was integrated, deliberately and methodically, into the art and architecture of one of the most powerful institutions in human history? To understand this possibility, it is necessary to look beyond what our eyes are trained to see. It is necessary to learn to read what was written not in words, but in forms, not in declarations, but in calculated silences. Because if there is a language older than any doctrine, more resilient than any dogma, that language is the language of the symbol. And symbols, unlike words, do not need interpreters to survive. They simply persist. They wait. They watch those who watch them. If this mystery stirs something in you, an unease, a recognition, a doubt that refuses to be silenced, stay. Because the most disturbing fragments of this investigation are yet to come, and the truth, when it finally reveals itself, rarely arrives from where it was expected. To understand how a symbol can dwell at the heart of an institution without that institution recognizing it, or, having recognized it, pretending not to see it, we must step back in time and contemplate the moment when 2 apparently opposing currents of thought drew close to one another in an unexpected and productive way. The Renaissance was not merely an aesthetic flourishing. It was an epistemological rupture, an era in which forbidden knowledge circulated disguised as sacred art, in which heretical philosophers financed by popes painted chapel walls with cosmologies that the Church itself would have condemned had they been expressed in textual form. Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, astrology, alchemy, and sacred geometry were not fringe practices in that period. They were the intellectual substrate of an elite that moved with ease between the cathedral and the esoteric circle. Men such as Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and Giorgio Vasari moved in this liminal space. They translated Hermetic texts under Medici patronage. They discussed the Kabbalah with rabbis and divine geometry with astronomers, and some of them later worked directly for the Roman Curia, influencing the decoration of spaces that would become inseparable from Catholic identity. It is in this context that one of the most thoroughly investigated hypotheses in occult symbolism studies arises: that certain artists of the period, steeped in initiatic knowledge, embedded in their works a parallel language, invisible to the uninitiated eye, but fully legible to those who shared the same symbolic horizon, not as subversion, not as blasphemy, but as preservation, as a gesture of transmission that would cross generations, regardless of the political and religious vicissitudes that might suppress the open circulation of that knowledge. In 1776, when Adam Weishaupt founded the Order of the Illuminati of Bavaria, he was not inventing a tradition. He was formalizing and reorganizing currents that had existed for centuries in different forms. The Weishauptian order, according to historical records, was officially dissolved in 1785 after being infiltrated and suppressed by European governments. But the question that persists, and that has fueled centuries of speculation, is whether the dissolution was real or merely administrative. Whether the group truly disappeared, or simply learned to exist in an even more discreet manner. And if the answer is the latter, then the search for traces of that survival begins precisely where traces are hardest to erase: in art, in stone, in the patterns that time has consecrated as sacred. Each layer revealed by this investigation carries another shadow with it. The veil does not open completely. It becomes translucent, allowing glimpses that demand interpretation. Keep watching. The story this episode tells has not yet shown its most disturbing face. Scholars who dedicate themselves to the symbolic analysis of Renaissance works frequently encounter a peculiar phenomenon. The more attentively a body of images is studied, the harder it becomes to determine where intention ends and coincidence begins. Take, for example, the recurring motif of the eye inscribed within a triangle, a figure that in modern narratives has become the near-universal emblem of the Illuminati. This symbol, far from being an invention of the 18th century, has deep roots in Christian iconography, where it appears as a representation of the Trinity and of divine omniscience. The all-seeing eye. The triangle representing the Trinitarian mystery, the light radiating from the center as a metaphor for spiritual illumination. But there is something that distinguishes the conventional representations of this iconography from the forms that certain researchers identify as potentially carrying alternative meaning: position, proportion, integration with other symbolic elements that, taken in isolation, would be innocuous, but that together form a coherent and systematic language. Controversial documents, among which are correspondences attributed to members of 18th century philosophical academies, suggest that the insertion of symbols into works of sacred art was a deliberate and codified practice. According to these sources, an initiate who knew what to look for could read, in any European city with a cathedral or a great basilica, a message that non-initiates would simply not perceive. There are theories claiming that the very process of commissioning works of art functioned in certain circumstances as a mechanism for symbolic transmission. The patron, who might be a cardinal, a bishop, or a member of the nobility with esoteric initiation, would specify to the artist, through instructions that would never be recorded in formal contracts, precise elements to be incorporated into the work. The artist, in turn, might or might not be conscious of the deeper meaning of what he was painting or sculpting. This is one of the most fascinating and most frustrating characteristics of this investigation: the structural impossibility of definitive proof. Because if the concealment was done well, it left no explicit traces. And if there are no explicit traces, any interpretation can be accused of being mere projection. But there is something that cannot simply be dismissed: persistence. The frequency with which certain patterns reappear, in different contexts at different times, produced by different artists who could not have casually coordinated with one another. Share in the comments what your instinct feels in the face of this possibility. Is it the voice of faith manifesting? Or is it the cold recognition of fear? The deepest answers to this question rarely arrive through reason. They arrive through the silence that sets in when the mind stops resisting what the eyes have already seen. And if the truth touches the invisible, if it resonates in that place in consciousness where doubt and certainty coexist without destroying one another, leave a sign of light on this journey. A silent gesture, but one that confirms something here has been recognized. No human institution exists without internal tension, and the Vatican, across its 2 millennia of history, has been the stage for conflicts that rarely surfaced with their full complexity. Theological schisms, struggles for temporal power, internal purges, unexpected alliances. The history of the Church is also the history of a structure that continuously had to negotiate between what it publicly preached and what it silently tolerated. It is in this space of tension that some of the most elaborate theories about the presence of hidden symbols find their most fertile ground. According to these interpretations, which have circulated in alternative academic circles and among independent researchers for decades, the relationship between the Vatican and certain esoteric currents was not simply one of confrontation. At certain historical moments, it would have been one of pragmatic coexistence, a kind of tacit agreement by which initiatic knowledge could circulate beneath the veil of sacred art, as long as it did not openly challenge the official magisterium. There are historical records, not controversial but frequently overlooked in conventional education, of Renaissance popes who kept astrologers in their courts, who collected Hermetic manuscripts, who sponsored translators of Neoplatonic texts, and who frequented intellectual circles permeated by philosophical speculations that, in other contexts, might have been considered heterodox. Pope Sixtus IV, who commissioned the construction and decoration of the Sistine. Pope Julius II, who chose Michelangelo and Raphael to immortalize his vision of power and faith in frescoes that humanity contemplates to this day. Pope Leo X, son of Lorenzo de' Medici, who grew up in an environment saturated with Hermetic philosophy and sacred geometry. These men were not naive. They were scholars, and what they chose to place in the most sacred spaces of their institution, and what they chose to ignore was being placed there, cannot be entirely separated from the intellectual context they inhabited. The invisible struggle that some theories describe is not, therefore, a simple war between good and evil, between the sacred and the profane. It is a far subtler tension between what can be said and what can only be shown, between the doctrine that unites the faithful and the knowledge that belongs only to those capable of seeking it. Whoever has remained in this investigation up to this point already carries the weight of a revelation that does not close itself easily. Because the question this tension raises has no simple answer. If an institution that prizes the sacred tolerated, or incorporated, elements of a tradition it supposedly opposed, what does that say about the nature of the sacred? About the limits between faith and knowledge? About the distinction between what one worships and what one fears? Which side of the veil would you choose to inhabit? The side of belief that does not question, or the side of forgetting that preserves peace? Subscribe and walk with us in this investigation. Each new episode is a key forged in silence, and each key, as it turns, opens one more seal. There is a theory, disturbing in its internal logic, impossible to definitively refute, that suggests that the most sophisticated form of concealment is not the hiding place. It is exposure. One who wishes to preserve a secret for generations has two paths. They can bury it in the depths, where only the most persistent will reach, but where the very act of hiding reveals that something exists to be found. Or they can place it before everyone, integrated into everyday life, absorbed by familiarity, protected by the last possible barrier. The inability of eyes trained for the obvious to perceive the extraordinary that inhabits the ordinary. This logic, which some call concealment in plain sight, would have an extensive historical precedent. The sacred geometry of medieval cathedrals, the numerical symbolisms in Baroque musical compositions, the acrostics and ciphers hidden in philosophical texts that appeared, on superficial reading, to be perfectly conventional. In all these traditions, the same principle operated. The symbol exists to be found only by those who have eyes to see. When one contemplates the architectural ensemble of the most emblematic structures connected to the Vatican, the square that opens like two arms in an embrace, the columns arranged in ellipses, the proportions that obey precise mathematical ratios, the inevitable question arises: what is the boundary between Christian sacred geometry and initiatic sacred geometry, between Trinitarian symbolism and Hermetic symbolism, between the orthodox representation of the divine and the codification of an alternative knowledge about the nature of the cosmos? According to some theories, that boundary was deliberately erased, not by accident, not by confusion, but by artists and architects who knew both traditions and who, with calculated mastery, created works that could be read simultaneously on two levels, the official and the initiatic. Works that satisfied the religious patron without revealing to the uninitiated everything that was being said. St. Peter's Square, designed by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in the 17th century, is frequently cited in this context. The dimensions of the ellipse. The position of the Egyptian obelisk at the center, a monolith from a civilization with its own elaborate tradition of sacred geometry, transplanted to the heart of Roman Catholicism. The proportions between the colonnades, fountains, and facade that, according to certain researchers, follow ratios related to mathematical values present in esoteric traditions that predate Christianity by millennia. Coincidence, aesthetic heritage, or a calculated message? If you have made it this far in this investigation, you are already part of this rite. The simple act of contemplating transforms the observer. Whoever looks without prior judgment begins to see patterns that were previously invisible, not because they did not exist, but because the eyes were not prepared to recognize them. Leave your mark in the comments of this journey. Write what your eyes saw and your reason still resists accepting. That is how individual silence becomes community. That is how the investigation continues beyond a screen. The moment has come to contemplate what this investigation has revealed, and what by its very nature, it can never reveal completely. The symbol of the Illuminati in the Vatican may be a historical coincidence. It may be the inevitable result of an era, the Renaissance, in which the boundaries between the sacred and the esoteric were fluid, in which the greatest artists of the Western world moved between religious commissions and initiatic traditions without that appearing contradictory to any of the parties involved. It may be that eyes trained to search for patterns find patterns where there is only art and devotion. But it may also be something else. It may be that certain symbols were inserted with intention, with awareness, with the confidence that the institution housing them would never notice what was being preserved within its own walls. Or, more disturbing still, that it did know, and that the tacit agreement between different forms of power was deeper and more enduring than any official record could ever capture. The truth is that no symbol holds power in itself. Power is born from what it awakens in those who contemplate it. And this is perhaps the most honest conclusion this investigation can reach. It does not matter whether the symbol was placed there by an initiate, by an artist unaware of its deeper meaning, or by a succession of coincidences that the human mind, biologically inclined to detect patterns, transforms into language. What matters is what it does to those who see it, because a symbol that awakens questions has already fulfilled its most essential function. The questions this episode raises are not small ones. If secret societies operated in the shadows of history's greatest institutions, what else may be hidden? If initiatic knowledge survived centuries of suppression by camouflaging itself as sacred art, what other transmissions still await recognition? And if history's greatest secrets were never truly hidden, if they were always right before us, protected only by our inability to see, what does that say about the nature of power and the nature of the sacred? While the corridors of the Vatican remain in their eternal silence, while the works adorning its spaces continue to be contemplated by millions of visitors who rarely stop to ask what they are truly seeing, the investigation remains open, incomplete by necessity, alive by vocation. The true secret perhaps lies not within the walls of any institution. It lies in that interior space where the question and the doubt coexist without destroying one another, where faith and questioning do not exclude each other, but feed one another, where the symbol finds its deepest interpreter, one who looks not to confirm what they already know, but to discover what they never knew they needed to ask. Write in the comments what the silence told you today. Sometimes it is there, in that space between what is seen and what is understood, that the truth finally reveals itself. The journey continues. In the next episode, we will dive into another mystery that official history kept in the margins. The suppressed documents the Church never wanted the world to read. Subscribe and follow us. Each new episode is a flame lit in the dark. And the dark, as always, is full of light waiting to be recognized.